Okay, good morning. I think we're ready to make a start. So this is ERSA's meeting reflecting on the spring budget. Really pleased to have Tony Wilson with us, who's going to speak about labour market analysis, following the spring budget, with a few reflections on what was missing. And after that, I'll just conclude the meeting looking at the announcements around UK Share Prosperity Fund and just informing you about a roundtable we had with some ERSA members and the DWP on Monday this week. But for now, Tony, I'll hand over to you.
Brill, thank you. I just realised I had the wrong presentation open, so I'll just bluff it while I keep talking and looking for my presentation. Hi everybody, it's a select few today, which is not a surprise. I said to Laura and Elizabeth last night, given there was so little in the budget on employment and skills, maybe we should just cancel. But they said no, let's do it. Let's press ahead and talk about what wasn't in there as well as what was in there. And then I thought I can usefully just give a sort of latest take on the labour market generally, and also hopefully you can see my slides now, and also some of the forecasts and some of the sort of labour market picture. So spring budget analysis, sort of. So bad news first. We're still in a deep recession. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But even with the V, this is the V, the sort of slightly limp V, the black line. We're not going to bounce back to where we were before. There's a permanent impact on the size of the economy relative to what it would have been if we'd not had this crisis. Now, the one thing I would say, though, I've pointed out here the November forecast. That's the yellow. Well, I haven't. This is the OBR's picture. I've just put the words on the top of it there. The yellow range was what the OBR was saying in November, and the blue line is what they're saying now. But just note, like, outturn has been a bit higher than what they were forecasting in November. It often is. Like, this happened in the last recession as well. The economy did a bit better than we thought. There's a lot of uncertainty here, and just note, they're forecasting a dip in outturn, which then drives a lot of their other forecasts in the early part of this year before a recovery. That's largely reflective of the this current lockdown that we're in. If that doesn't materialize to the same extent, then there might be a bit of upside here. Things might be a bit better, but let's see. We'll get a clearer idea of that in the next month or so. So anyway, permanent impact, and that has a permanent impact on living standards and on employment. The good news, though, the better news, though, is that in as far as that impact could have been felt on unemployment, in particular mass unemployment, we've definitely now averted an unemployment catastrophe. So 6 months ago, a bit more than that actually now, isn't it? What month are we in now? March. So 8 months ago, many of us were fearful, and including the OBR, this was their forecast from the OBR, fearful that unemployment was going to shoot out of control. We'd be facing maybe 4 million unemployed, maybe as high as 5 million unemployed people. By November, with the success of the job retention scheme in particular, but also through the labour market adapting, through employers and workers adapting to the impacts of the changes, to the impacts of the crisis. Sorry, somebody's. Would you mind just muting everybody, Callum or Elizabeth, when you get a sec? I'm just getting a bit of feedback. Then by November, unemployment was revised back down to about 7.5% as the peak forecast. Yesterday, or this week's budget, the figures came down even further to a forecast peak of 6.5%. And actually, when you dive right in to the detail here, when you look at that light blue line, they're actually forecasting in the immediate term, then a spike, which is basically as a job retention scheme unwinds. They're forecasting quite a significant impact from the ending of the job retention scheme. And then it's slowly starting to return back towards a slightly higher longer term rate of about 4.1, 4.2%. Not much different actually to where we were pre-crisis. So this could definitely have been a lot worse. So we've seen GDP fall by 10% in 2020. That's the largest fall that's ever been recorded, certainly ever recorded this century in GDP. Payroll employment fell by about 800,000 at its peak. It's recovered a bit since then, which would be the largest since the early 1990s. But that's only a 2.5% fall in payroll employment. If it followed the same path as GDP, we would already have seen 3 million fewer people in work. Already have seen 3 million fewer people in work than before the crisis began. There's no doubt, it could have been a lot worse. And actually, the optimist in me says that I think we may well not get 6.5% unemployment. We may well find it comes out a bit better than that if we stay on the roadmap out of lockdown, if the vaccine continues to roll out, the vaccine's successful in preventing deaths and reducing pressure on health services and giving us all the confidence to get back to eating out and shopping and arts and leisure and culture and so on. It may well not turn out as bad as 6.5%. And just again, like right in detail in what the OBR are forecasting here, you can see here the blue is what they think is a contribution of average hours, and the yellow is what they think is a contribution of employment to changes in total hours. So in effect, the kind of output, labour output in the economy. So during the crisis itself, most of the impact has been felt in hours, and employment / unemployment has fallen like a bit. That's basically the 2 and a bit percent. Well, I think they probably used the LFS data here, but on the PAYE data, it's fallen by about 2.5%. But look, in a bit I've circled here, Q4 2021. That's when the job retention scheme unwinds. They're forecasting the average hours are going to not just bounce back to where they were when the job retention scheme unwinds, but actually average hours, so the hours worked per worker in effect, are going to end up higher than they were before the crisis. They'll come back and they'll rebound even further. And as a consequence, or not as a consequence, but related to that, unemployment will then rise significantly. Employment will fall significantly in that quarter. Now, that's a bit complicated, but there could be like compositional reasons that explain why average hours are going to increase. If a lot of jobs that have been lost are in relatively short hours working, hospitality, retail, and so on, then the total average hours in the economy might rise a bit. So that might explain it. But also, I think it could just be assuming that a lot more of the impact is felt on unemployment than is felt on hours. In my view, my reading of what happened last summer and last autumn, and indeed what happened in the last recession, is that even notwithstanding the job retention scheme last year, people come back to work. They come back to work often on shorter hours, in less secure work and in more flexible work, and employers take people back. My hunch is we'll probably see more of the impact on hours later in the year, and quite possibly less of the impact on unemployment, and unemployment may well not be as high as 6.5% by the end of the year. But we don't know. I mean, it's also worth bearing in mind the job retention scheme. By the end of October, there was only still a lot of people, but there was 1.4 million people on full furlough, so fully off work, and about another million people who were on partial furlough, so working flexible hours. Bear in mind, in October, large parts of England were still locked down, and some parts of them had never affected, particularly in the northwest, had never really left lockdown. Assuming we do in effect lift lockdown in, let's say, by July, August time, it seems to me very, very, very unlikely we would have more than 1 million people on full furlough. And I think a lot of employers have made their adjustments already in terms of redundancies and reorganisations and restructures. So that's not to say there won't be an impact from the end of furlough. I believe there will, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's going to end with I hope it's going to end with a whimper rather than with a bang. We may not see. I think the days of mass job losses are definitely behind us if we can stay on the path out of lockdown. I might just have frozen here, nattering on too much. So that's the sort of context. Key budget measures at a glance. We can talk about more of these in questions if people want to, but extension of furlough to September with employer contributions starting to kick in July, August. I think it's July, maybe it's August, but I think from July it's a 10% contribution.
No, but I doubt it would be that much. But I'm not too sure because I'm not next to him. I said sorry, one second.
Jeffrey, yeah, thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. So the second point, a lot of business support, which which I know a lot of businesses won't have overlooked, but I think we do need to acknowledge, significant funding, emergency grant support, continued grant support for hospitality, accommodation, leisure, as well as continued VAT holiday and other measures, access to loans and so on. That's going to make a big difference in supporting businesses, particularly in leisure, accommodation, hospitality. The extension of the apprenticeship hiring incentive and an increase to £3,000 has drawn a lot of criticism because it's extended it beyond young people in particular. So it no longer acts as an incentive to take on a particular group. It's just an incentive to create apprenticeships. And hiring incentives tend not to have very high take up. They tend not to have much additionality. I think there's a lot to recommend in having hiring incentives. I think the apprenticeship incentive is probably a net positive, but pretty small impacts. It's one part, it's one part of the puzzle, and probably quite a small part. £7 million for flexi job apprenticeships. I think in general, anything that supports apprenticeship training agency type models or group training type models during a recession is a really good idea, because employers are reluctant to take people onto their payrolls, and this can enable, this is a good second best. 126 million for 40,000 more traineeships, which I think is really welcome. And I think, the more we can do to extend and rehabilitate traineeships over the coming years, the better, as long as they're, good quality traineeships and a path to employment. We've got a reprieve on the £20 universal credit cut through to September, and more detail on Community Renewal Fund, Living Up Fund, which I think Elizabeth will talk about. Plus, let's not forget, the government did a lot in previous fiscal events, and that's only really now starting to come through, and some of it still won't come through for a little while. Work Coaches Restart, Kickstart in particular. But even if we've avoided the worst, I do think that we still need to do a lot more to repair the damage, and I think the budget was disappointing in not really having any measures on these 6 areas, which I will take in turn. On hiring, as I said, I think hiring rather than firing is the most significant challenge that we face, as it always is in a recovery. Recessions, follow a similar path. You have a massive shock, labour market shock, and a lot of people lose their jobs. That can continue for a while, although job losses always slow down after the initial shock. But it's how quickly hiring recovers that determines how well the labour market recovers overall. We need to get hiring well above where it's been in recent years in order to make up the lost ground on employment. And the expectation, the gamble, I think, by the government is that as we reopen the economy, this is going to happen really quickly. But it didn't really happen last summer. A lot of firms were still going through a massive adjustment last summer, which they're not going through now. So it didn't happen last summer. But there will still be adjustment costs this summer too, as furlough unwinds again. And also massive economic uncertainty, particularly in sectors and industries affected by Brexit. Where those impacts are just growing and will continue to. There's other things that can give us some cause for confidence, particularly around the amount of money that's being saved and many households have repaired their finances. But at the same time, we know that the bottom fifth of households are worse off than they were pre-crisis. I mean, overall, I am pretty optimistic. As I said earlier, I'm fairly optimistic we can stay on the recovery path. But I think this was the moment, this was the fiscal event to give the labour market some help. So to put some coal on the fire, and then probably put some petrol on the coal as well, if it were up to me, either through recruitment incentives or through cuts to non-wage labour costs, in particular raising the threshold for NICs, national insurance for employers. We haven't done that, so I think we're putting a lot of hope in a quick recovery. I've illustrated this here. This is really good administrative data source of flows into and out of work. It's a pay as you earn data on flows on people starting jobs, which is the blue bars, the number of people who start a new who move into a new PAYE job each month, and then the yellow bar is the number of people flowing out of PAYE employment. And so the difference is that, sorry, this is by starts, I mean moving from out of work to in work, not within. And then the difference is the it's a change in employment, whether it goes up or down. So you can see here the impact of the crisis on job losses, which was pretty much flows out of PAYE, which was an immediate shock and then recovery, and actually flows out of PAYE employment very weak after that. But the flows in is really concerning. There's signs of recovery now, but it needs to be a lot higher, and we've got a lot of ground to make up there through that crisis. And it didn't really recover the ground, as I say, as the economy reopened last time. And we see that in vacancy data. I won't dwell on this, I'm not wittering on too much. You see in vacancy data as well, they haven't recovered anywhere near as much as we might have anticipated or might have hoped. You know, this will come back after lockdown, but I do worry about the amount of spare capacity in the economy and the level of uncertainty that might hold hiring back. Second issue, job creation. A really good way if you want to support hiring and support jobs growth, and indeed support good employment, would be to spend some money on creating jobs. Three areas stand out here. I mean, social care, which we called for explicitly in our budget submission, you know, is in crisis. The government have said that they'll end the crisis in social care. They've promised plans and they've never delivered on them. Buildings and energy efficiency, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, you know, two really big areas which will support net zero, which we will have to do between now and 2030, really. You know, these are things we have to be doing in the next 10 years, and that they create jobs everywhere. It really baffles me why we didn't announce more on this. There's a lot of investment funding and green bonds and so on, which will come through eventually, mainly into infrastructure projects. But these feel like two areas where we could have moved very quickly. And local services, you know, local government finances are taking a hammering, in particular because the council tax base and rates of, you know, income are falling. And you know, as well as actually a lot of the things that you know, the income that's got from people being out and about shopping and parking and everything else. Now those the government has provided from time to time sort of emergency patch ups to keep the show on the road, but you know, we really could be investing in expanding and supporting renewal and recovery through local public services, and I think it was again a missed opportunity. Not a massive surprise, given the sort of the political stripes of the government, but I think it was a missed chance. Not only were these things missing, the budget has penciled in further future cuts to public services. This is a very detailed table, but the gist is, if you look down at the bottom, the change since March means the change since last year, in effect, kind of pre-crisis. In other words, 2020 and 2021, massive increases in public spending, resource spending, but then 22, 23, 24, big decreases, you know, big cuts, paying it back, consolidating. And actually the change since November, that bottom bit, you know, this is the changes that have been penciled in or assumed in this budget, an additional 3 billion odd a year coming out of public services. And given the protections that are in place for defence and health in particular, although health probably needs even more money now, given the protections in place there, you know, these are pretty big falls actually that are going to fall on unprotected departments. Third area, long-term unemployment. This is now, I put these on different axes because I didn't really have time to do long-term unemployment as a proportion of all people in work. So on the left-hand axis, you've got the unemployment rate as per the latest forecasts, and then on the right, I've just put a reasonable projection of what might happen to long-term unemployment based on what's happened to unemployment in the relationship between the two in the past. Now this suggests it will peak at about 900,000. I just saw actually in a tweet this morning, Resolution Foundation have got a better graph of this actually showing the level of long-term unemployment, but I think they probably use a slightly different definition. So when I do this, I'd take 6 months plus for young people as being long-term unemployed and 12 months plus for other groups. That's just how I've always done it. So that's probably why it comes out at a slightly higher number. But the point is, you know, we're looking at a really significant increase in long-term unemployment. It's going to more than double. And on that definition, 6 months plus for young people, 12 months plus for others, you know, we're looking at probably about 900,000, potentially nudging 1 million people long-term unemployed. Importantly, it's going to peak probably in late 2022, mid to late 2022. You know, and we all know when Kickstart is ending, you know, why you would end Kickstart at the end of this year when the worst is definitely ahead of us on long-term unemployment, I don't know. And it's already rising for young people. So this is where we are now. This is how that 500,000, which we're up to pretty much now, breaks down. You know, it's a larger number on that 6 month plus definition for young people, but it's going up for everyone. And last time round, I used this graph in lots of presentations, the share of of the change in the long-term unemployment rate rose fastest and longest for young people, and peaked about 5 years later, 5 years after the start of the recession last time around. So these are particular risks. I think Restart is going to make a really big difference. I think there's another day we can talk about the changes to Restart that the government have put in the DVP have put in the final documents. It looks really good. Put a discount floor to minimise cost cutting. They've put a performance cap to reduce the risks of providers gaming their offers, and they put in measures to try to support reinvestment of any excess profits and ensure that money stays in the programme. It's all really welcome. It's well funded. It's big volumes. I think we've got enough to make it. I think there's a lot in there that can make it a real success, but it's going to take time. And I think demand is going to outstrip supply for Restart and through to spring 2022 at the earliest. And I do think 1 year is too long to wait for young people. And I think it's the wrong way round, actually. I think having Restart kicking in after Kickstart doesn't really make sense. So, we and many others have called for a meaningful jobs and training guarantee for young people in particular. And in practice, and loads of people call for that. The Youth Employment Group we've called, which I'm part of, which we're part of, we've called for that and campaigned for that. The Labour Party have a form of a jobs and training guarantee now. The Alliance of Full Employment called for one. There's a growing momentum around it. I think the detail of how you do it is quite complicated because a lot hinges on what you do with something like Restart, whether the guarantee happens before that or you change Restart and have the guarantee after it. But either way, we need a guarantee. We need a commitment to eradicate long-term unemployment for young people. Fourth piece, and then I'll nearly there. I'll just run through these quickly. Tackling disadvantage. And this has been really overlooked. Young people haven't been overlooked, although I do think we need we do need to draw us all together now to a meaningful guarantee. But 3/5 of all employment has been amongst young people. Some of the bigger issues we've got though, the disability employment gap is stuck at about 30 percentage points. I mean, it's shocking, appallingly high figure, and it was narrowing because of a combination of the economy and demography over the last 5 years. It's now stalling again. The ethnic minority employment gap has been narrowing somewhat, but it's pretty worrying, particularly for black people. It's looking like the figures have got worse. Young people not in full-time education, the gap's widening. For older people, it's largely unchanged, but there are significant variations within that, particularly by gender and also by other disadvantaged groups, combinations of disadvantage. And we found in particular in our work with Youth Futures and Blagrave Trust that young ethnic minority groups do appear to be particularly losing out, with the fall in employment for young black people 4 times greater than for young white people, and for young Asian people about 3 times greater. So combinations of disadvantage appear to really matter here as well, and this largely reflects occupational changes. So I do think we needed a lot more, at budget on measures to, particularly around work and health and disability employment. I think it's, I'm really concerned that we haven't got any, we're still waiting for the national strategy that was promised last year, and that we don't have any long-term funding settlement or increase in funding for tackling labour market disadvantage for disabled people. But also, it's very hard to see how we're going to address wider inequalities, particularly for ethnic minority groups, within the measures that have been announced so far. The 5th point is about job insecurity, job quality and low pay. This is a crisis that has particularly affected the low paid, 3 times more likely to have lost their jobs. So this isn't fall in employment, this is likelihood of leaving your job, 3 times more likely to have lost their job than people who are not low paid. This is in the second quarter of 2020, so i.e. the crisis. And we're also seeing signs that as jobs growth is starting to return, or as the labour market is starting to recover, we're seeing increases in number of people who are working part-time because they can't find a full-time job, which is a blue line, and are working in temporary work because they can't find a permanent job. And we've got, as well, alongside this, got 3.5 million people who are underemployed, who are saying they want to work more hours, and that's increased by nearly 500,000 since the crisis began. So these are all like really significant warning signs that we may see a rise in insecurity and low pay, and that is particularly likely when if unemployment peaks lower than 6.5%, It just means more of the impact will be felt in hours and pay. And the OBR kind of concur on the general point about pay, forecasting the earnings growth. So the left is the year-on-year change and the right is the kind of just the growth in earnings in effect. Both these graphs are pretty grim reading. The right one's easier to see, to follow, but earnings are going to grow a lot more slowly than we were originally forecasting, and that feeds through again into incomes and living standards. And the point I'd make, I think, on this is that actually, given that we're putting quite a lot of money into support for unemployed people, if some of that doesn't materialise, I think we just need to be much more flexible and responsive to be able to gear our programmes and our support much more to people who are trapped in or cycling in and out of low-paid work. We didn't do that in the last crisis. We didn't really do that at all. So I think we need to think through how we can be a bit more adaptive and responsive to what happens in the labour market in how we then deliver support. So if unemployment is not as significant as we fear, and if we're getting a lid on long-term unemployment, then we really need to be focusing on labour market disadvantage and inequalities and on how we support those in low pay. And linked to this, recession plus weak recovery means lower incomes. And the average, this is the average, the black line is the key one, the change in household income growth. The average across the economy is that, we saw incomes fall in 2020. They're going to be slightly lower in 2021. And then they're going to be, this has been revised down a bit compared with last time, actually. They're going to be below 2% household income growth over the period 2022 to 2025. And underneath that average, we've got a lot of households, people who are able to work from home and haven't lost their jobs and haven't had to go on furlough, where their incomes have held up pretty well. And then we've got a lot of people who've had really significant hits to their incomes, and that's going to hold back growth, but also it's got implications for inequalities and living standards as well. Finally, and I'll shut up. We really do need to patch up the safety net. There isn't. Universal credit's only one part of it. There's no justification for cutting universal credit by £20 in September or October any more than there would have been to do it now. This is going to need to stay in place for the long term. I think it needs to be, in effect, it needs to become a permanent change, hopefully as part of some wider reforms. But this is in effect for the half of people who are on UC who are in work, it will be a tax rise during a very weak labour market. For the half that are out of work, it will compound the misery of having lost your job or being out of work during a crisis. But it is only part of the challenge, and some of the other things we call for, and lots of other people call for, frankly, for the budget. We do need to extend and improve the coverage of statutory sick pay. I think it needs to be at least £200 a week. I think it should be available from day one, and I think if we increase statutory sick pay, we should also reinstate the version of the percentage threshold scheme that reimburse smaller employers. We need to widen access to test and trace support payment, if not just pay it to everybody who's required to isolate. We really must suspend the benefit cap. This is going to, I think, blow up as an issue in the next few months. Already, sorry, I put pound signs in there by mistake. So already it's doubled to 170,000 people. That's people, not pounds. Pretty much doubled. It was about 90,000 pre-crisis. And out of that, about 100,000 of those people are lone parent families. In effect, it's, as people who were near the cap already got the £20 uplift, the benefit cap kicked in and took it back from them. But the problem is the 9-month grace period for the benefit cap is ending. And as a consequence, we're going to see a lot of people being pulled into the cap who left work last spring, summer. So this really needs fixing. It was a horrible, pernicious policy in the first place, it was never going to be a headline in the budget. But I was hoping in the detail they might have done something about it. And then final point, we need to do something about support for low-income renters, because we're seeing increasing rent arrears, increasing rental debt, and the local housing allowance is not sufficient to cover the rents of people who, particularly people who were on low to middle incomes and who lost their work over the spring, summer. And if the point of the local housing allowance is to try to encourage people to move, for example, then clearly you can't do that during lockdown. Similar to benefit cap, if you can't move, if you can't get a job, then these policies become sort of self-defeating. So I didn't really have a conclusion. I was just going to stop there. So look, overall, I remain pretty optimistic about the labour market at a very high level, but I'm really, really concerned underneath that about prospects around long-term unemployment, around insecure work, labour market disadvantage, and in particular the risks of widening inequalities and really significant impacts on low-income households. I think the budget missed an opportunity to do that. We're not going to get as good an opportunity as we had now to do that in the future, but I think we will certainly be continuing to press on these sorts of issues. Elizabeth,
Okay.
over to you. Also,
all right, thanks, Tony. Before I just talk about some of ERSA's work in this area, have we got any questions for Tony? Any comments? Any contributions? Can we do the hand raising if you want to come in at this point? Mark, I can see your hand raised.
Hi, hello. Sorry, I'm not going to put my video on because it's gone all grainy and it's like snowing.
I think we've lost you. Are you still with us, Mark?
Is that coming through okay?
Yeah, we've got you again now. Yeah.
Okay, apologies. All right, thanks, Tony. Very much. I just wanted to do a really quick quiz for you, Tony, about how you see that translating into where you say, Restart is a big major program. We've got Kickstart for young people and a whole load of initiatives, including on the skills side. In terms of additional programs, do you see tier 2 of CARES being meaningful and happening and complementing? If so, is it cohort programs, self-employment programs that are very targeted with flexible part-time working? What kind of immediate things spring to mind as well? That could be a good idea to run an additional program alongside Restart and Kickstart and the other initiatives.
I have no idea. It's a good question. I'm not aware of any, but it's obviously because I think they're not going. They don't necessarily saying they're not going to do it. So are you about to come in there, someone? No. No. So I just don't know. So I'm not aware there's any money sloshing about for potential program spend that DWP have earmarked as tier 2 commissioning. So yeah, I don't know, but I'm not. I don't think that. I mean, I don't think there's a program line, a program budget that we can look forward to that's going to come through there. But I don't know if Elizabeth's got a better idea of that.
There's nothing. There's no glimmers of any information. They talk positively, like commissioning will take place of tier 2, but there's no indication of what or when at this point.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to put that question out there, though. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a really good point. I mean, I think we should start getting our ducks in a row for the spending review, because there will be another spending review probably in the autumn, and I don't know if their plan is going to be for a single year or a multi-year one. But the next thing that DWP will need to think about is what other programs they are commissioning, and whether that's tier 1 or tier 2 or more money through flexible support fund. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, no, it's a good point, and I think that is going to be an opportunity to think about. I mean, I still kind of feel like with unemployment on, I think better than we feared. I think that will feed through into lower long-term unemployment than we might have feared a year ago. And I think the 2.9 billion allocated for Restart may end up significantly underspending. And if it does, I think that's kind of the money it'd be good to get our collective hands on, to think about how can that be used to support some of these issues, some of these priorities.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Nick Parker, I can see your hand raised.
Just another dimension to this. I'm trying to get my head around. You saw some statistics about the number of people that have left the country, migrant labourers who've gone back home. Obviously, they were working, a lot of those. Big jobs became unavailable, they've gone. Will they be wanting to come back? Will they be able to come back? Actually training communities here to take up some of those jobs when there's been a reluctance. There's a whole treacle there, which will be interesting to see how that plays out. And I suppose what are the policy influences or whatever, the investment to actually make those jobs more attractive and get people ready to take those jobs that are here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a really good point. And we don't know this. We don't quite know the scale of it. And we've stopped using We've used PAYE data instead of LFS data, labour force survey data, in part because of this, because there's some issues with the LFS now because of the population is much lower, but it's not being reflected in how the labour force survey is being used, being weighted. But it could be up to 1 million people, which is not insignificant. That's a couple of % of the labour market. Now, and as you say, they're somewhat more likely to have been working than others, although the employment rate generally is very high. My only sort of caveat on the point that, you know, this could create labour demands that we could meet by helping more people who are out of work to get those jobs, is that if, like me, you feel that high immigration in the 2000s for the most part didn't lead to higher unemployment for people who are here already, it feels to me like low immigration now, by the same token, isn't going to necessarily lead to lower unemployment for people who are here now. In practice, you know, what tends to happen is it just makes the economy a bit smaller. And so for all the benefits that we might get by the fact that there might be more jobs in agriculture or in food processing, which there might be, you lose some of that because the economy is a bit smaller, and so other jobs aren't being created elsewhere. You know, there's fewer people in the labour market, there's fewer people working, we have less income as an economy. So there might be some benefits, but overall, I think in aggregate, it's unlikely. You know, it's unlikely to make much of a difference on the sort of the big numbers. But I think certainly in those sectors where migrant labour has been particularly has played a particularly important part. Particularly, you think about, you know, things related to food processing, to agriculture, to some parts of hospitality and accommodation. Then you know, those are areas where there should be demand in future. And where I think employers are going to have to improve conditions quite a lot to encourage people to take those jobs.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Have we got any other contributions? Can't see any more hands. So thank you very much. I can see Patrick Hughes. Patrick, do you want to come in?
Hiya. Sorry, I'm on sound only. Hi, Tony. Good stuff. As always. The government has been pretty silent on place in all of this. I mean, it's not a word that they tend to use. One might call it locality. But if they get into, with any degree of seriousness, we shall see with the levelling up agenda, there's going to be some kind of focus surely on places where unemployment and long-term unemployment remains stubbornly high. Do you think there's any mileage for the sector in exploring a bit more actively place-targeted activities?
Yeah, definitely. Particularly if you operate in a conservative-held seat in that's not in the south of England. I think then you've got a good chance of suddenly finding a few million or tens of millions of investment heading your way. Particularly if it's a rural area, you've probably got a good chance as well. I sent a tweet along those lines, which I hastily deleted after because I thought actually.
You can blame me now, Tony. Say what you think.
Well, I mean, it's shocking, isn't it? I mean, something like 40 out of the 45 areas awarded funding through I think it was through the Towns Fund, were Conservative-held seats in the Conservative-held constituencies in the sort of Midlands and North of England. I think place is like really, really important. Elizabeth will talk about this in a sec as well. I think, you know, there is a window now to be putting ideas together and for local areas to be putting bids into Levelling Up Fund as well. I think this is part. We also do probably for spending review need to be thinking about what this means for the where sort of power and funding lies on a lot of these agendas as well. And in particular, I mean, I don't know. I do think there's an opportunity here to sort of revitalise and reinvigorate the role of local government in coordinating employment and skills and economic development and regeneration support, which happens clearly. I mean, I see Matt's on here, and it happens in combined authorities. It happens in many parts of the country, but yeah, in many places it's really, really hard to do because, in particular now, because of the massive hits and massive pressures on budgets. So yeah, I would like to see a bit more of an openness across government to collaborate on some of that. But yeah, let's see.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else before we thank Tony and move on to the ERSA section? No? Tony, thank you very much. I knew that you'd have lots to share with us, lots of insight, lots of information. Thank you very much for that. Puts it in context. And also just that whole thing about the unanswered questions. And I think our opportunity now as a sector to do some work around whether we still think, because I think most of us do, that there will be a need for recruitment incentives. There's a lot of calls about what could be done beyond the Kickstart offer to young people. Lots of stuff about how we can do things around job creation. So it's really good to see Tony highlight those things around social care and energy efficiency and buildings and the whole local services to sort of respond to the economic crisis and the health crisis. So sure, there's lots more conversation to be had, and certainly get Tony back for some of those. I just wanted to refer to ERSA's extension letter around Kickstart. So we wrote from members of the Kickstart Forum. I'm sure people involved with Kickstart will know that it's had a slower start than we'd hoped. I feel that as a community of good practice at ERSA, we've spent a lot of time with the DWP problem solving and making sure that we can make Kickstart the best it can be for young people. So ERSA members wrote a letter calling for a Kickstart extension, and it's fair to say the first drafts of that letter were going around our Kickstart community just before the Youth Employment Group then did a similar call. So we edited our letter, revised it so that it was something that came in behind the Youth Employment Group's call, and we wrote to the Chancellor ahead of the budget. We did that, and I felt it was absolutely right that we should do that, but we did it in a sort of context of we didn't actually expect a Kickstart announcement this week. So we're carrying on with the call for an extension, and just want to urge anybody who's involved with Kickstart, attend the ERSA forums. We've got the next one on the 10th. We are continuing to have meetings with the DWP present to get those little things right, or the big things right that still need to be done around Kickstart. And we are going to sort of continue with that call for an extension. So that's the Kickstart part of the budget. And then the thing that I agreed to do, just to move on from what Tony was talking about, was the sort of the work around the shared prosperity. And I'm not very good at sharing and slide showing, so I'm hoping that you're going to see this. If anybody can't see it, perhaps somebody can shout, "We can't see it," for me. So one of the things that ERSA has been working on, probably since the word Brexit was first heard and the beginning of all that, has been around what would come to replace European funding for employment support. And many people that are here this morning will know that way before we'd even delivered New Deal or the work programme or the work and health programme, employment support organisations were delivering provisions with European funding. And we've been able to do that work that reduces disparities, that's around work, poverty, community, helping people get economic independence. And so if ever we need a continuation of that work, it is now as we recover from this pandemic. So lots of work done at ERSA, lots of work done by ERSA with partner organisations like NCVO, Local Government Association, Locality, Equally Ours, with that wider group that we are part of. But also work done by ERSA members. So we waited for an announcement this week. We wanted to know what's going to happen next with the Shared Prosperity Fund. So we saw the announcement of the 100 pilot areas, And this does overlap a little bit with that conversation we were just having with Patrick's contribution, because there's some surprises on the list, and there's some omissions on that list. But we do now know what's going to happen, or we think we know what's going to happen with the £220 million for the Shared Prosperity Fund pilots. We still have some opportunities to influence, and we know where the priority areas are. And I think there's lots of questions to be asked about what happens to people that in places on the second list referred to as other places. So ERSA's continuing to raise some questions around that. So what we've learnt this week is that the pilot programmes will initially target these 100 places that have been identified as most in need. And as I say, we're not sure what index has been used for that, but we now know where. So let's just get on with it. There is, at this point, we're going to be looking at funding for early years and work-based training. So I think for ERSA members, it's about looking at what that work-based training is going to be, and looking at how we can work on and influence the investment in communities and that whole place thing, particularly around the digital connectivity, which many of ERSA member providers have realised the gaps and how hard it's been in some areas delivering remotely in the last year, and issues that have come up at the digital forum. So we're continuing with our sort of lobbying around the pilots. We've not given up on the shaping work that we're doing. And we also know that there's going to be this second portion of UKSPF, and that at this point, we will be able to start delivering to people most in need through the sort of bespoke employment and skills programmes. And I think at that point, it comes back to the things we've done before, about being in the right communities with the right offers, with very local, specialist tailored offers that link back into local labour markets and local labour market needs. So lots of work for the ERSA UKSPF groups continuing around this. And I think the other thing is that we saw a commitment which we'd been hearing about before, that there's a commitment from the government to at least match EU receipts on average around £1.5 billion a year. We heard this in the previous announcements, and you'll be aware that ERSA's previously called for the expenditure on shared prosperity to be the equivalent of all money spent, the monies from the European Union and the UK match. The UK match, which over the years has been that additionality, the intervention rate, that 40-45% match that we've found from other sources. So we're going to continue to do that, even though we may think it's a bit of a lost cause at this point, because announcements have been made twice now. And then just finally to let you know that on Monday this week, ERSA had a round table with the DWP. The ERSA team attended with 21 member organisations, and we had a discussion around 6 questions. This was the homework we were set in advance. I thought it was a really good, productive event. It was really good to take 21 ERSA member organisations who spoke positively with solutions, who didn't bring their own organisational issues, who spoke on behalf of the sector. It was a really, really good event to be at. We have written up a report, bullet point report, about the contributions made on that day, and we've already shared that with the DWP, and I think it will go out in the ERSA bulletin, if not today, early next week. And we're then going to reconvene the ERSA UKSPF forum on the 30th of March to actually talk about that whole conversation we had this week about our knowledge in the sector about what good looks like, so that we can have our chance to shape the pilots, to shape the future of shared prosperity. And I think we are the organisations that have delivered, you know, for 30 years in some cases on SPF, but also that know what's happening in communities and know what's happening in local labour markets and in sectors around where we're based and where we're working. So I think it can be a wider influencing piece, and it can tie back in to the question that Mark Cousins asked about what might be commissioned off Tier 2 and Tier 3. I think we've got this window now, where as a sector we've got to have loud voices. And I just also wanted to flag up another date, that next Friday, when we do Employment Support Scotland, we will pick up the UKSPF conversation there. And we are working really closely with Wales Council for Voluntary Action on the sort of work in Wales. But for all the 6 points, there was really strong recommendations, and ERSA's going to work these up. Let's see what happens now. I believe we're going to get a portfolio around the pilots. Still trying to influence what might be in that, and hopefully we'll be able to make some really good use of the report that we launched last November, and it still seems really current, really up to date, the Sharing Prosperity report, and we're just going to try and build some recommendations that go alongside that. So I hope that's sort of useful, putting ERSA's work in that context. And I'm having a little bit of trouble getting back to you guys, but okay. So I hope that if anybody wants to ask any questions about what ERSA's doing in this regard, please do. But I would encourage you just to come to the forums. So we've got next Tuesday, next Friday, and the 30th for the UKSPF one. Okay. Is there any other contributions before we wind up? Thank Tony one more time and get our day back. No? Okay, well, thank you. It's Friday. I'm sure for lots of people they're still engaging with Restart. But for the rest of us, have a good weekend. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Tony.